spring is an awakening, as you know, so this is actually Gavin to kind of capture the sensibility. Thank you all for coming. I'm glad to see some of my students here. Thank you, and there will be an extra, candy cane in your Christmas stocking. This is our fourth literary spring event. Deanna is nodding her head because she's been to all of them, so that's a wonderful thing. And we meet each spring to affirm what we believe are the poetic qualities of spring. On this, what I think is a truly wonderful season. I think that you will all agree that it is a season in which we can affirm certain visions. And I've talked in some of these earlier gatherings about the fact that spring gives us a sense of kind of Chaucerian delight and Eliadian despair. For those of you who don't know what I'm referring to, take any class with me, and I will make that quite clear and obvious. Spring has come. Some of you know that we've been waiting for spring for a long time. The last literary spring saw us go through what I think has been a fairly remarkable set of seasonal changes and weather that is quite awful. You didn't know that I'm a weather watcher, did you? I could give you weather forecasts well into the future in case you need to have those forecasts. Spring is a time of beauty. We talk a lot about the notion of the beautiful. Spring is a time of rejuvenation. Spring is a time of opportunities for redemption. Spring is a time when we move into hope, into a season of hope, of calmness, moving to a kind of a fullness of warmer days ahead of us. We celebrate literary life here on campus because we recognize that movement toward calmness and fullness, and we move with joy to a sense of promise that life gives us in spring particularly. Spring is a time of promise and openness and reaching into a future. It's something like the rise to redemption that each of us anticipates in our own lives. And we feel this season as a time of possibility. That's a critical word, the notion of possibility. So it's fitting today that we are honored by the possibilities explored by our two poets, Stephen Schroeder and Wally Swist today. Their splendid poems consider linkages, promises, and avenues of redemption. For us as individuals and as people of community, that's particularly apt here at Sacred Heart because we do feel truly a sense of community here on this campus. Stephen Schroeder's work has been described as marked with a remarkable clarity of voice and dexterity of vision, as crisply philosophical and elegantly imagistic. And they examine paradoxes and mysteries with wry wit and bemused wisdom, distilling, as critics have said of his work, complex observations and masterful lyrics, generous, resonant, and glimmering. Wally Swist's work, and especially his Crab Orchard series and poetry award-winning book, One Poe and the Dimensions of Love, illuminate the important but very subtle issues of life, providing true insight and worthy observations about the signals of meaning and rising to that rare level of elegy and song. Stephen Schroeder was born in Wichita Falls, Texas. Anybody here been to Texas? All right, a couple of you have been to Texas. He was born in Wichita Falls, Texas, and grew up northwest of Amarillo in Oldham County. It was there, he says, that he first learned to take nothing seriously. I thought a lot about how to pronounce those two words, to take nothing seriously, to take nothing seriously. And I guess the emphasis here is on the word nothing, because as Steve was describing to me yesterday, there's such openness, such a vastness of plain, that every clump of dirt, every clod of soil was critically examined and cherished. He earned his undergraduate degree in psychology at Valparaiso University in Indiana and went on to earn a PhD in ethics and society from the University of Chicago. He is co-founder with composer Clarice Assad of Virtual Arts Collective. He currently teaches at the University of Chicago in Asian classics and in the basic program of liberal education for adults. He taught at Shenzhen University in China from 2002 to 2010, most recently as professor in the School of Foreign Languages. He also taught at Roosevelt University, at the University of Northern Iowa, and at Calumet College. Steve is the author of more than 20 books, many of them collections of poetry, but others philosophical and religious studies texts. He's also published scores of scholarly articles, including studies of the relationship between poetry and philosophy, between religion and ethics, and the role of the Lutheran University in the 21st century. Wally Swist is a Connecticut native who studied at Yale University. He is the author of more than 20 books and chapters of poetry, many of which have been published in letterpresses. His most recent book, as I mentioned, Wang Po and the Dimensions of Love, was selected by Yusef Komyanaka as the co-winner in the 2011 Crab Orchard Series Open Poetry Competition, and was published by Southern Illinois University in 2012. He's also published a children's book, as I mentioned, called Moscow Ballet's Great Russian Nutcracker, and also a study of Robert Francis and Robert Frost under the title The Friendship of Two New England Poets. He has taught at Southern Illinois University in the Connecticut Poetry in the Schools program, and for several years in the Night of Fresh Voices program, in which he worked with gifted high school students through the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival in Farmington, Connecticut's Hillstead Museum. He's received many honors, awards, and grants for his work. I'm privileged to call both of these remarkable poets my colleagues and my friends. I'm delighted to continue working with them on a variety of poetry projects and other literary efforts. So Literary Spring at Sacred Heart University, the English department, and the library, as Gavin said. And we're all proud and pleased to welcome Steve Schroeder and Wally Swist.
Well, I am very, very pleased to be here, and it is a delight to read with Wally, to see some now familiar faces, and I'm grateful to Jonas and to everyone else who's made this possible. I want to start. I think that poems should speak for themselves, and so I'm going to keep my introductions to a minimum. And I want to start, we're going to go back and forth about 10 minutes each and then 10 minutes each, a couple of rounds. And I want to start with a sequence of poems called Seven Sorrows. That's a very formally structured sequence, but you'll pick up the structure as you listen, I think. And in reply to Jonas's introduction, Seven Sorrows really looks back to Lent. And so it's looking back to a more sorrowful time, a time of repentance. But I will also read a poem from a sequence of poems in response to Dietrich Bonhoeffer's prison poems that he wrote while he was imprisoned by the Nazis before he was murdered at the very end of the Second World War. And in spite of that sad story, it's a more spring poem, which will lift us up, I hope, a little bit after the heavier Lenten poem. So I begin with Seven Sorrows. And Seven Sorrows has just been published in a letterpress handmade chapter. Actually, my daughter wrote it. She's the big. Seven Sorrows. Soul-pierced Mary, homeless, has nothing to say. In the light, a child sheds on the whole. Simeon sees all he's hoped for. Seeing, he is ready to go and says to Mary, "For this child many will fall and many will rise, and the child will be a sign rejected, and this will pierce your soul again and again." But Anna, who is a prophet, silent, turns, sees, says nothing to Mary, says all there is to say to all whose minds are stayed on freedom. And having done what they were called to do, they all went home, and the child grew as children do, wise in God's grace. As children do, wise in God's grace. They say Joseph spoke with angels too, but did not pause to ponder what they said in his heart. And so, without a second thought, he flew to Egypt when one whispered, wise children may be better dead, to powers that be whose power lies uneasy, where many rise, as many are rising. Come again, this angel said, when I say the word, and soul-pierced Mary, homeless, again, said nothing, like the prophets. Like the prophet. Jerusalem every next year at Passover, and in his 12th year the child is lost. Seeing this, Mary and Joseph need no angel to turn them, and turning, they see the light, seeing their child lost in questions. And they say, what have you done? And he says, why did you turn? I have always been at home. I have always been at home. Joseph is gone. Mary is just one of the daughters of Jerusalem weeping. Sentenced to die, the wise child says, do not cry for me, but for yourselves and for your children. The day will come when you will say it is a blessing to be childless, when you will long for a mountain to fall on you, a hill to cover you. If all this is done when the wood is green, surely, the fire will burn hotter when the wood is dry. The fire will burn hotter when the wood is dry. Mary and Mary and Mary in the shadow of the cross, weeping in the long shadow of principalities and powers Simeon saw. To his mother, the wise child ready to go says, your son is the friend who is standing there with you. And to his friend he says, your mother is the woman weeping. And soul-pierced Mary, homeless again, says nothing like the prophet. Nothing like the prophet. A secret disciple petitions powers, takes the body to a tomb. Seeing her child lost, Mary does not need an angel to turn her. Turning, she sees the light in the absence where her child is and has been always at home. And soul-pierced Mary says, nothing like the prophet, homeless again. Homeless again. At the place where he was killed, there was a garden, and in the garden was a tomb, and the tomb was near at hand, and it was time to rest. So they put him there, and he was gone. Soul-pierced Mary, homeless, has nothing. Thank you. And the second poem, as I said, it's a poem. This is a series of poems written in response to poems that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran theologian, pastor, who was a participant in the plot to assassinate Hitler, wrote at the very end of his life. It's called Untended. Consider the cornflowers. No one has planted them. They do not toil, neither do they reap. They grow free, knowing no one begrudges them life wide as the sky. The people sweat and work the field for daily bread, but they suffer the cornflowers to grow, to bloom there. And even Napoleon's army cannot prevail against their freedom. Playful, daring spirits springing friend to friend. You must not live by bread alone, but by every bloom that springs from the blue place people suffer to grow on the other side of the hedge. They make around the sweat of their brow, the work of their hands, from the play of possibility outside the lines. Not law, but the good news of free desire, the blue flowering of earth untended.
I had scrupulously planned what I was going to read, but and I will follow up on some of that. But after Steve reading the sequence he just did, I'd like to segue with a poem from Huang Po, The Dimensions of Love, entitled The Annunciation. And it was the writing of this was precipitated by friends of mine who sent me a Christmas card, and I put it up on the sill. I had a writing residency in the woods, and the painting just spoke to me. It's after the painting by Sandro Botticelli, circa 1485, The Annunciation. Having taken the bodily shape of a man, Gabriel is struck with by the weight of the news he delivers upon entering the threshold where Mary kneels, cloistered in the room beyond, the spoken words nearly making the archangel stumble, his cape trailing behind him. A gilded ray of light radiates above his upturned wings, and the sprig of lilies he cradles in his left hand. The transparent plane of his halo holding a constellation of golden stars, his right hand pulling up his gown to brace his bowing in obeisance. Upon hearing his greeting, Mary is troubled and begins to draw the folds of her blue cloak across her breast into converging shadow. The arc of her halo, like a divine hand placed behind the white veil over her head. Is this not how we respond to first hearing any rejoicing, especially a message that awakens in us the beginning of understanding, of a life's path unimagined? Or if imagined, then unrealized? How do we accept what is miraculous, other than by looking through the portals of the vestibule where Gabriel is about to bend to his knees, where the life beyond informs us with the voice of the words we hear? And as Mary waits for what she is to become, we listen as the one expectant. I'll be reading next a poem entitled Vixen. It's a nature poem. A lot of my work deals with nature, and it's a piece I worked on, just finished this year after working on it for 12 months. Vixen. Here on the farm, the vixen hunts during the day. How exquisitely she moves, how beautifully fox red. Whenever she breaks off the language of her body that intends never to be seen. Last Sunday, I crossed over to the windbreak of leafless trees among the hummocks that descend into the drainage ditch beyond where she was tracking, unaware of my immediacy within a few yards. So mindful was she of mice, of rats in the matted stalks of the meadow. This afternoon she emerged in the clearing beyond the barn. I watched her stretch and shake luxuriously, so unconstrained after a day and night of winter rain. Now she begins to trail a new scent, nose down among the dark roots of the browned grass. Sinewed, she articulates open ground on black-furred feet, a streak of flame igniting the wind, a mind at one with the conflagration of the moment, shoulders punched, arched hair on neck, her vernacular perpetual patrol and reconnaissance, her sudden disappearance only an exhibition of her sudden reappearance, her reappearance the command parlance of her disguise among what is apparent in her inexorable leap, pouncing on a meadow vole, or whatever stirs beneath her, as our hearts quicken, her foam-flecked tongue flashing, the tail of her succulent prey brandished between the wedge of her jaws. These poems, except for the initial poem, are new poems from a manuscript entitled Dinner with Camus, which I think moves more to a philosophical and a deeper spiritual place than Quang Po. This next poem, many of the poems in the manuscript are homages, and that's how Steve and I will segue as well. This is entitled Mary Oliver. My memory of her is as evanescent as the light bulb camera flash of a Stieglitz portrait of O'Keeffe. The image that remains with me is that I furtively studied her face, the quietude of its naked sensuality, the way you feel the self-conscious trembling of a spotted doe when you have entered the meadow where she is browsing, or the sight of the bearded mussels that disappear and then reappear along the stone quay, reaching out into the sea in rhythm with your doubt that you may have even seen them from afar, and the vision of them between the white-capped surf that reaffirms their existence, washing over their iridescence again. After having walked into the bookstore she was working in on Commercial Street in Provincetown, what I noticed more than anything was her stillness those 35 years ago. As I browsed the poetry section, occasionally looking around and sometimes between the shelves of the rows of books, as fluidly arranged as the shells among the stones found along the sand of the beach. There she sat, behind the counter, mist draping the cobblestones of the street, the sound of the tide beating time on the shore. Her living presence made me think of Vermeer's The Girl with the Pearl Earrings. Although she didn't even require any adornment, jewelry would have diminished the radiance of, as she breathed into the study of quiet that she became. Regarding homages, this is a poem. It's a dream poem. This is entitled "Dream of Judita Vesionate," and it's for Jonas Zedanis. In the dream, she arranges me to meet aboard the cutter. Our hair streams in the wind, and I ask her about the women sitting upon the rocks of the harbor and standing among the stony cliffs along the shore, all singing in the polyphony of Hildegard von Bingen. And she informs me that they protect the city, that they turn away the ships of enemies and guide the vessels of its friends. Then I ask her about the ranks of men harvesting the ripe coastal grass for haying. And she answers me that this is one example how husbandry is inculcated into society, that in another life, many of the men seen harvesting were proponents of selfish means who favored plundering the earth for profit instead of managing the balance of her natural ways. Aboard the cutter, in the dream with the wind in our hair, she speaks a poem about wreathing a rainbow in the sky on the day before she died, after a night of heavy rain. In the book that glows with the images of her beloved Vilnius, after I turn out the light on the night table, her poems page through my mind with the icons of their image of wild chamomile, plum blossoms, and bitterns contained in the lyrics. Dandelion honey, the red of autumn sage, the mother of pearl clouds about to vanish from the sky, like the great wings of the sea eagle, who is no longer lonely, and as dusk is extinguished on its wings, her white hair changes again into the black hair of her youth as I awaken from the dream with the sound of the cutter still in my ears. I'm going to read two more poems in this set. And this is another animal poem. It's entitled Mink. Standing beside the brook pool that winter morning where I had scattered the ashes of my yellow Labrador, bright February sun igniting the snowbanks into glare, the sound of its nails over the ice crust just beginning to escalate into a roar as it adjusted the long, lithe yard of its stunning black-furred body in its attempt to steer down the slope of one bank, then another, sunlight flickering off the radiant oil of its coat as it veered, appearing to drift uncontrollably on a line straight toward me. So quickly, I didn't even think of sidestepping over to the left or dodging right, but remember edging backwards towards the flange of the brook's icy ledges. When it was only a few feet away from me, it angled to its right, and in one fluid, wildly acrobatic motion, leapt after taking several running steps to grab hold of the trunk of a hollow sycamore on the bank. For a moment, it looked at me, and I stared back, its claws dug into the tree bark, not with hostility, but as in embracing the familiarity of its home before ascending into the top of the trunk's empty cavern, the sound of the brook's rush merging with the sunlight flashing over the frigid water, clouds of breath steaming the frosty air. And this is a poem for summer, Black-Eyed Susan. Butter yellow inflorescence, ballerina skirt ruffled in the wind, common sweetheart of wildflowers, who eschews the solitary for a throng of other Susans, the brown, dark purplish center of one of summer's most obvious, most subtle of baubles, double gold, Indian summer, marmalade, your various shades parade your inimitable humor, leaning wildly windward, rising in a stand, resting together in the sun, the summer's lushness no longer lush without your strong-stemmed, unconstrained bounty. Solstice celebrant, resplendent Susan among so many Susans.
Wally and I were talking about homages before we started, and sort of hit upon that as one of the ways to make our poems relate to each other. And it occurs to me, first of all, the poem that I read responding to Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a poem that the section of his work that I was responding to talked about the importance of the love between friends, the circle of friends. I was thinking too of Miguel de Unamuno, who said, "I believe in God as I believe in my friends." And so what I am going to do at this point is read a series of poems, all of which I suppose are homages of its sort. They're really poems written for and dedicated to friends. And I'll say just a word about each of the friends, I suppose, but again, not much by way of introduction. The first three poems, as it turns out, are all for my friend Sobai King, who is a Macanese painter from Macau, who is trained in traditional Chinese ink brush painting, but also has spent time studying in Europe. And you can see this in her painting. She and I have collaborated on many works now, and she often will do paintings, ink brush paintings on rice paper responding to poems that I've written. And I sometimes will paint in response to her poems and vice versa. So she painted the cover for this book called Turn. And the first poem is responding to this painting. And I know I'm holding it up as though you can see it all the way in the back there, and I know you really can't, but you can look at it later if you'd like. The poem is called The Way Ink Thinks, after Sobai King's Turn, Turn, Turn. Turns, 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 time turns, white on gray, the way a snake coils on a warm rock in sunshine, waiting, thinking, the way ink thinks, finding its way on paper, porous as a mountain, the way a mountain thinks, permeable, rising in air on the line that would be if you drew your brush from the eye of a circling falcon to paper, the eye the only thing moving, once the tree cut falls. You can see where the water brushes it, where the brush touches it, draws it out, and you can see blood. In the eye of the mind, going, going, the way poem goes, going where poem goes. You can see a way clear from earth to sky on every edge. The edge of the paper, the edge of the ink on paper, the edge of drifting blue on mulberry grains, where fiber and fiber embrace to make a plain surface on the edge of the holograph world we think we occupy. And two more poems for Sylvie King. The Going, Not the Gone. Finding is the first act, finding cracks in every foundation common daisies dance through, knowing every break in every wall a grace. The second loss, the moment you learn to see in the dark where there is no opening, the common weed between rows, the silence between words, no containing the silence. And Dark Radiance. When sky is full of moon, white, still, cold in May, black light turns the world bright and it is time to fly. Chill, you know ice lies at the heart of all this. A touch in the wind makes you shudder, cry, and it is not sadness. Continuing with the poems written as homages of sorts for friends, I'm going to skip over here. And actually, I want to do something just slightly different. This is more of an homage, not for a friend, except in an indirect way. Jonas already said I was from Texas. I'm from West Texas. I'm from Northwest Texas, High Plains, and I did learn to take nothing seriously there. There's a lot of nothing to see. And I want to tip a hat to that in a couple of poems here. This poem is called East of Hannibal. East of Hannibal and Lyle Lovett is going on about penguins. When I spot a Cooper's hawk perched on 6 feet of what has been drifting since before the blizzard began last week, I could have lost control watching, but you can't lose what you never had. In that moment, the hawk goes nowhere, and I fly, my mind on the road again, past the sign that points the way to Mexico, barely visible above the snow line, the sign that says Louisiana 19 miles, thinking twice about where I am now and when. You all might have to go and check a map on that later. That actually was written in Missouri, but it was written while I was listening to Lyle Lovett, so it is a Texas poem, in a manner of speaking. Now, another poem dedicated to a friend, a very fine poet, Chris Ellery, who is a poet based in San Angelo, Texas. And I asked him about participating in a project, and in his response, he used a phrase that I thought cried out to be turned into a poem. So this poem is called For Spring, with thanks to Chris Ellery. I am committed to nothing for spring. I will join a ceremony of empty tombs with a green Eucharist on the edge of a desert suddenly damp with late snow after April thaw. Listen for rainbows breaking into angles light makes when it strikes what I thought held nothing worth seeing. Another spring poem dedicated to a friend that a number of us have in common, Katya Mikova. Again, an excellent, a wonderful, wonderful poet who has been a great friend and inspiration. This poem is called Baba Marta. An old woman with a twinkle in her eye makes the world stop still as ice in blue light, so bright it takes the breath right out of your eyes when they step back into the liquid world and open again after the slow thaw. She leaves laughter to the young, who receive this bright moment as an invitation to play, an explosion of possibilities, but her smile contains all the laughter she has gathered in memory. In a low place, snow has drifted over my head, and the only thing moving is wind that would pass right through you if you stepped out in it. This is the world as ice, not water. Nothing happens. Light falls cold for hours and hours after snow has ended. The blue of the sky slips into shadows that mark where snow has drifted. The white of the snow rises into clouds feathered across the arc of the sky. In flat places, wind has swept dry grass into view, but there is no sign of it where snow and wind and light have drifted to make a clear canvas where spring will paint the day after tomorrow, and everything on this road will appear to move again, and everyone will say again and again, nothing like this ever happens here, though nothing happens like this every year. Spring will be a miracle again because the memory of water passes at the speed of this cold light. That poem was actually written stuck on Interstate 40 in western Oklahoma on my way home to Amarillo after a massive blizzard that pretty much brought the whole place to a stop. Another poem dedicated to Katya Mitova. Again, no introduction. I'll just plunge into it. It's called Souls Falling. Tolstoy is Anna, you say. And my mind goes to the poem, to the fine line between the saint and every other fallen soul in a world full of souls falling. One fall is as good as another, always coming to rest in the same world, always falling again, always thinking there might be another, always casting stones, never more than a stone's throw from being the target. With all the stones cast, you'd think the world's sinless, every target exhausted. No wonder Lev Nikolaevich fell in love with Anna, who wrote his whole life from the still point where he met her, where she drew him out of her mind. And I want to do many more poems, but I think in the interest of staying within my time, I'm going to move towards the end of this collection and do, again, a series of poems that are homages of a sort. In one case, the reference is in the title, so that's all the introduction I'll give. A work of the hands, a meditation on Cavell, reading Thoreau, on writing. In the middle, always present between eternities, past, future, towing the line, the arc between death and death, taking place, dwelling on it, dying to be alive, not in the beginning, the word between this, that, and the other, beside the point, before, after, the thing is not the word, but the placing of it, always drawing what is out, not to fix the word spoken before, but to dance every word written means this, not that, in this language. Meaning, nothing, totally meaningful. You see what I'm not saying? The significance of being, not saying who, when, as well as what. We must be born again to speak the language of the written word. And finally, a series of poems that I suppose are homages to my native land, starting with something called In a Coffee Shop in Amarillo. Still without form and void, the world is nothing more than webs of words woven between chance encounters. Some God says, let there be, and thinks it good, but it is no such thing. This place makes time bend, holding a cup for the moment of warmth more than what it contains, while the stones sing, I can't get no. I try, and I try, and I try to embrace nothing that is here. Say it is good, say it is very good. I also have great difficulty with the maps that show the center of the country turning red and speak of red states when they mean they've become very conservative. And being from Texas and spending a lot of time in Oklahoma, I try to address that difficulty. When I see the map turning red, I tend to think it's moving left instead of right. That just dates me. But I wrote a poem in Oklahoma called Red that I want to read to you, and then one final poem. Again, I think the homage to Oklahoma and to a number of other people will be clear from the references. Red. What you can't say, sigh. What you can't sigh, sing. What you can't sing, dance. Red moon rises clear as day on the edge of the city, so sweet you can taste it from here tonight. And I think this is where the earth down here gets red. And I hope it stays a long, long time. Long enough for all that light to fill us with all the madness we need to remember what a red state is, what a red state Oklahoma is. It hangs slow, slow, shining, nothing but light, and there's space enough in that for every single one of us to dance. Up don't mean down, and out don't mean in unless we stand together. The side of the sign that don't say nothing is the side of the sign on the side that belongs to you and me. If you see something they say something that I say. You can never say I without meaning we, even when you forget. I say look at that moon like nothing you've ever seen, and say what you see, dance. And finally, a poem called Turn, and it's the title poem of the book. I usually would be reading this poem with my sandals on so I can make a reference, one footnote that I have to get in advance of the poem. Discalced, it's a very strict religious order of Carmelites, and it involves being strict enough so that you don't wear shoes, which to me is not a form of suffering. You'll get that. The poem is called Turn. Sick and tired of being sick and tired, I told my wife I was looking into joining the Franciscans. Knowing I'm temperamentally Trappist or anything discalced. She said, what do they make you do? And I said nothing, but I thought again and said, preach good news to birds. And she said, you do that already. And discounting the possibility that she meant nothing, I said, nah, they preach to me. I just say amen, and all this came to mind today when a friend reminded me this is St. Bonaventure's Day, and in his honor she's trying to ignore little annoyances, but I suppose those would be the ones a Franciscan scholar would embrace. Suffer the little, you know. And that got me thinking about the mind's journey in, as I recall, not up to God, present wherever it was, said a preacher of another order, but a like mind. You left the divine, which could be anywhere. Turn, turn, take off your shoes. Every step you step on holy ground.
In preparing for this reading, a very dear friend of mine, Michael Miller, suggested when he heard I was not reading a specific poem, he said, I think you should read it. It's entitled Mystery. What I'll be doing this set, I'll be reading some poems from Huang Po and the Dimensions of Love, and also some poems from a book entitled Velocity that Steve will be publishing. There's, he and his daughter's working on the cover right now. This is entitled Mystery. Joseph Campbell, the noted expert of comparative religion and mythology, once was asked about love. And he didn't answer the question. He actually answered the question. He mentioned that good Buddhism was enjoying your food and enjoying your friends. So even Joseph Campbell could not quite answer that specific question. Mystery. Somehow I could tell you entered the cabin, and before I unlocked the door, I checked for the extra key beneath the brick at the southwest corner. Somehow I know it has been moved, that it is not where it was before. I imagine I can inhale the aroma of your skin within the sweet scent of the pine this cabin was built with. I know how your aura moves across any room, trailing those blue and gold lights. How you must have listened to the wind singing through the remaining leaves of the trees in the late October rain. I know what appears to be madness sometimes can be love, that it is something more inconsistent, and then even more constant, and always more beautiful than any of that, so that it remains a mystery that no one else, especially the two of us, can understand. This is the title poem. It's Huang Po and the Dimensions of Love. Huang Po taught his students they were already enlightened. I know of one student of Zen who threw a translation of Huang Po out of his apartment window, and the book, like a block of wood, made it on more than one occasion into an open trash can beside the curb. This is not unlike the dimensions of love. We feel the elephant ears of it, massage the lion's paws of it, stroke the tiger's belly of it, and are startled by the snort steaming from the nostrils of the horse of it that has run the field of it. We are illumined, but we are unwilling to acknowledge its power. So we remain unable to find what it is in ourselves that is either falling in love or agape, not understanding at all, nor understanding what is sublime. We may be able to pick through the litter of the streets to discover a translation of Huang Po's teaching among the trash. We are the ones who threw it there. We confuse seeing the wood with the true wood and lose each other halfway. We see the wood of ourselves, but miss the divine grain of the ordinary. The heron is my talismanic bird, and seems that this poem seems to have become a favorite reading poem of mine. It's entitled Great Blue. When the great blue heron appears through the leaves of the trees lining the banks of the Farmington River, I think of all that is marginal in this life compared to those slow, powerful wings rowing the air above the river's heart. The plumed head looks to the left, then to the right, as it cranes to peer into the water of the river's swift current, cresting its banks, flowing with the rush of the insistent June rain. And I think of you, and wish you had been beside me to see the great bird, that sacred vision, rowing the air and searching the heart of the river. So, I think, is this why I am alive, that being with you is like stepping into the sunlight after days of rain, and to know that you are opening in ways you have never opened before. I think, as the great blue heron flies out of sight, that I row the air above the river of your heart, neither of us being able to comprehend those powerful wings, unable to gauge that the vision of the epiphanal would be a reason anyone standing on the banks would want to break into song, and might even propel the heron further into following the strong current of you, surging past the low-hung, tendrilled leaves. There is a connection between Steve and I, an individual named J.C. Rochelle, who happened to be Yale campus Lutheran minister when I was in New Haven, and I would visit with Jay on a weekly basis, although I'm not Lutheran, which tells you a lot about both of us. And I found out, I wrote this poem years later, and then I also found out that years later that Jay found this poem somehow, and he used it in one of his sermons, so I think I should read this. It's called Destinations. We're in such a hurry that we miss our true destinations. We need to observe that flock of pigeons along the way, roosting on a flat roof, pebbled with white stones, cooing and contented in the late warmth of November sun, beyond which lies the river, and its reflection throbbing as it flows before it empties into the sea. We need to remember to return to the source whose center can be referenced anywhere, blessed by the name beyond names, transcribed by us through each act, our auras pulsing, as in knowing when one has finally arrived, crouched among the stones, hiking snowy mountain, the stream having drawn us off the trail, as if the light were a sound rushing in our ears. I'm going to read a couple of poems from Velocity and end with a poem from my collection, Luminous Dream. This is a short poem entitled Recognition, and it's actually only 10 lines, but I worked on these lines on and off for many years. Recognition. A man dreams about the child deep within him, and a train of many cars passes through the dream with a familiar face behind each window. In the passing of cars, he sees his own face as it appears in the dream, and the light within him shines in each window and reflects his childhood. In the reflection of his face, the child deep within him awakens from a dream. Jack Gilbert just died in November of last year, and he was finalist for the Pulitzer Prize this year for his collected poems, and he was a friend of mine. This poem is entitled Another Poem About the Moon, and it's for Linda Gregg and Jack Gilbert. More than 20 years ago now, and the memory still shimmers within me of that late evening and early morning, the candles that Linda lit to accompany our tea and biscotti flickering between us, our resolute conversation regarding American poetry, the world order, and the crystal that life is itself. However, what served as its own denouement was the delight they both shared openly in front of their spontaneous guest, sometimes behaving as if I weren't there at all. Their previous incarnations with each other going on at once, teacher, student, lover, friend for life. Then Linda getting up to bring our empty cups and plates over to the wide porcelain sink, and pausing before speaking, beginning breathlessly, "Oh, Jack," and turning around from the semi-darkness with her beatific face haloed by the mane of blonde hair, conjuring the immemorial magic to raise up what shines in him. "There's something I want you to see. I've written another poem about the moon." This is entitled Zebras, and it's actually part nature poem and part love poem. It'll be the final piece I'll read today. Zebras. The black and white stripes blur due to their quickness and what is tattooed into the pigment of their hides by racing through the grainy sands of the equatorial sun. Who wouldn't intuit streams of their movement even before they wade through the pools of water in the shallows of their quenching? As they shake off the dust from their tomahawk manes, they are never any happier when they gallop over the dry banks of the channel after they have plashed through river mud. In this lifetime, when you mail a card to me signed Your Zebra, with stripes bearing themselves on the front cover, and the smudge of your kiss a carnelian stamp pressed onto the back of the envelope, it makes your stallion Winnie. Whatever scent that you infused within allows me to imagine how I would inhale the aroma of your skin as we stop in the wind of our own making among antelope and gazelle. Let us run apart from the herd. Let our stripes blend together across the grasslands of the savannah. May we bask felicitously among irascible hippos, and, oh darling, may we outrun the lions. Thank you so much.
I think we can applaud more loudly than that. Steve and Wally both graciously agreed to answer questions and engage in a conversation. You know, the creation of a poem is the creation of a work of art. And there's an intensity there that's a personal intensity and a public intensity. And I think that we've seen the personal here become the public. And I wonder whether you, as listeners and observers, might have a question or two to ask about how one creates onto a page that sense of personal intensity. Any questions? Make one up. I'll do what I'll do in class. I'll start picking on people. You know how I do this.
I have a question.
Yes, Corey.
When you said your poem was only 10 lines, but it took you a long time to write it, why do you think that is? That's my question.
It's my own theory that there's a kind of mathematics regarding the lyric. And the lyric in that poem weaves into and out of, it parallels the whole dream, the tone of dream in the poem. And I needed to get it just right. It's more than just bridging the gap between creating an image, which is somewhere between cliche and something that's very fresh. But it needed to be just the music in those lines needed to be accurate. Mm-hmm. So it was much longer. Actually, it was a much longer poem. And actually, I initially tried. It began as a villanelle, and I really felt that my lines weren't long enough, so I kept on cutting it and honing it, and that's what I fashioned.
Mm-hmm.
Marie.
I have a question for Stephen. I wondered if you would speak a little bit more about working with a visual artist and how, that affects you, or how it affects how you approach a poem, and how that dance happens between you and a visual artist. That was very interesting to me.
Sure. I mean, it's something that I love doing, and Viking and I both have done both, and so it's interesting to put in a sense 4 visions together when we collaborate, because oftentimes there's a painting on both sides and a poem on both sides. And I think that poem that I read, The Way Ink Thinks, is an attempt to respond to that in a manner of speaking. That the physicality of the painting and the way, I don't know how much you know about rice paper, but rice paper, which is actually made from mulberry bark, has this very wonderful absorbency to it. And so one of the things that happens when you begin painting on it is the ink takes on a life of its own, even more than it does on other watercolor paper. And so it moves, and it moves sometimes in ways that you can't predict. And I think that's very much like what a poem does. And so thinking about the physicality of the ink on the paper, the making of the paper, because my daughter makes paper, and then thinking about how that connects with the structure of the poem, and along the lines that Wally was talking about, the mathematical or musical structure of the poem, which is always a paradoxical combination of being in control and being totally out of control. which is emphasized for me working with someone like Kate. We recently did a reading in Macau where she painted as, there were two of us who were reading, she painted as we read. And so the painting emerged on the spot in response to the poems. When I was reading that poem, she said to me, "Slow down." And I said, "You know, this is a fast poem. You're going to have to paint faster." And I think that kind of dance is just, it's a wonderful thing to experience. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'd like to ask a question. Jeff first.
I really like, for Wally, I guess, I really like the vixen and the blue heron, because not because of what you did, but because there's something you didn't do. They didn't seem to me to be personified animals or anthropomorphized. Sort of like you walk right up to the edge of it and turning them into a person and then did it. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your attitude toward animals. It's like a Zen thing, like a beginner's mind, you know, to accept the animal for what it is and not try to turn it into another human being. I thought that was very interesting.
Thank you so much. I think three quick points on that is that I think of some other writers who write well or write in that regard about animals without an anthropomorphic take on them. Ted Hughes, I think, does that, but Mary Oliver has a wonderful phrase, "The more you look, the more you see." And I think that for me, being in nature, the more, there's a poem I didn't read, but that regards bloodroot that I wrote last spring. And I write about it, is seeing one flower first and then looking up the slope and seeing it just ascending the slope. So I think it's allowing nature to speak, but I also practiced in the haiku genre quite avidly for about 15 or so years. And in haiku, you basically juxtapose two or more images to provide insight into the luminous or into what is common, but that you have an aha moment. And I think that kind of Zen element has kind of carried with me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You mentioned Ted Hughes and Mary Oliver. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the other poets, American poets or otherwise, who have inspired you.
Oh, well, the list is long because I've been a reader. Robert Francis was my mentor, and Robert Frost said of him that he was the best unknown poet in America. That probably is still the case. There are too many, I think, to know. I've read a lot in translation. I've enjoyed Bly's translations, but certainly. There's a man named Joseph Langland who was once the head of the MFA program. He was the initial director of the MFA program at UMass. Ted Hughes said that he wouldn't have written the poems in Crow if he hadn't read Joe's nature poems. So I think that there's a deep and long lineage going back to Langland and going back to Francis. And for me, it's been Whitman regarding consciousness. So I think those are a few names I could.
Steve, do you want to take a shot at that discussion?
Sure, and I would agree with Wally. The list goes on and on and on, and in a certain sense, everyone is related to everyone, and so it's this massive conversation. But I certainly would list Wallace Stevens as a primary influence, very philosophical poet, Emily Dickinson, who showed up in a number of the poems that I read. Walt Whitman is a common influence, the Zen influence. We have talked about doing a reading together where we only do poems directly inspired by Chinese poets and or Zen. I think we'll do that someday. And the work of translators, certainly. And I would list these two poets, Jonas Danis and Wally Swist as major influences for which I'm very grateful as well.
Wally, how do you define poetry?
Can I do that again?
How do you define
I
poetry?
thought
So
that
that's
was
the
it.
easiest
Question.
Well, I'm
Wow.
a poet.
Thanks for
I
directing
go
it to
for
Wally.
I go for the I'm a poet.
I'm waiting to hear.
Well, that's a rather difficult question, actually. It's a short question, but I think I had in Jonas's class, I had mentioned Vladimir Mayakovsky's book, How Verses Are Made. And I think that for me, it's actually walking in nature. Even if I write a poem regarding another theme other than nature, it's usually through the matrix of natural imagery. So it's walking, and then often enough that, as Mayakovsky also writes, that the pace or the rhythm of your walk really informs the rhythm of the poem. So I think that that's a first tier answer. But I also poetry is. I've been working spiritually with presence, of being here now, of being in the moment, and my poems try to address that. They really try to address the perpetuity of this moment, of this eternal now. So my poems are informed, or I think a lot of poetry, my favorite poems are informed with that arc, with that calculus, so to speak. And then, of course, I love music and the image being, I think, central to poetry as well.
Steve, could you add to that?
Well, I could say amen to begin with. But I'm thinking too, just a number of short definitions instead of just one. I think the idea that poetry is language that calls attention to its own form has always been very important to me. And I think of the line that the dancer and theorist of dance, Doris Humphrey, used for dance, but I like to steal it for poetry. She spoke of the arc between dying and dying. So there are two stationary movements, and it's the arc in between. And I think, yeah, that's sort of what poetry does. And there are more, but that's enough for now.
How about one more question, and then I'm going to invite you on behalf of the library to go downstairs and eat cookies with your friends. Christina.
I'm not sure which one. The poem Red, that you talked about Oklahoma being red.
Yeah.
I know what you're referencing, but the image of Oklahoma being red, you mean something more. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I can talk about it a lot if you want me to.
Yeah,
But I'll talk about it a little bit for now.
Not defining poetry, but like, just, you know.
Right. Well, part of what was going on there was my defensiveness, in a manner of speaking, because there is a tendency to dismiss Oklahoma, Texas, much of the western United States as being this wasteland of right-wing, closed-minded thinking. And I'm constantly trying to point out that that is not universally and uniformly true. And I was standing on the edge of Oklahoma City looking at this beautiful red moon, thinking about the redness of the earth, thinking Oklahoma, of course, is the location of many sovereign Native American nations. Red means something very different in that context. It also was the state by percentage that gave the largest number of votes to Eugene Debs, the most serious socialist candidate in the history of the United States. It has this wonderful radical history. It also has this very undeniable right-wing presence. And I thought, as a poet, it was incumbent upon me to play with that. And so I wanted to play with red, literally the redness of the moon, the redness of the soil. And in Oklahoma, there comes a moment at which the soil changes and it becomes red. You can read The Grapes of Wrath, if you want a wonderful literary description of that moment. So I wanted to play with the literal meaning. I wanted to play with the association in the Native American nations there, with the history of progressive thinking in a place that's now often dismissed as having no such thinking. And so there's a serious political purpose in it, a serious philosophical purpose, but it's also just fun to play with words like that. It can mean so many different things. And it makes you want to dance, right? That's why I have to stand up when I read it. And I'm doing it now. I dance with my hand. So great question. I could say more if you want.
Well, let me thank, before we thank the poets for the last time, let me thank Gavin Farabee and Renato Ciaffi for hosting this gathering today, and Professor Jeff Kane, Chairman of the English Department, for encouraging literature and creative writing and all poetry on campus. Most of all, of course, Steve Schroeder and Wally Swist.